This lecture is about angiosperms and their fruits. We'll begin by talking about the development of fruits. Then we'll talk about the basic structure and functions of fruits, and then we'll end by looking at the various types of fruits. So I just wanted to start by orienting you to this picture. You may or may not be able to see these tiny little numbers in the bottom left-hand corner. So we're trying to illustrate a chronology of fruit development, starting with the bursting of the floral buds, which you can see here in 2, and then we've got the mature flowers here in 3. And then after fertilization of the egg, which is inside the ovules, which are inside the carpels, which make up these flowers. So after fertilization of the egg, the fruit starts to develop. And that's what we see here. So this is a nectarine plant. So this is the tiny nectarine fruit starting to develop. So simultaneously, as the fruit is developing, the ovule is developing into the seed. So the fruit is developing from the ovary wall. In some cases, it's developing from other parts as well. And it's going to enclose the seed. So remember, the ovules were inside the ovary in this flower. After fertilization, the ovule is going to develop into the seed, and the ovary wall is developing into a fruit that's going to enclose the seed. So here we see the fruit ripening. It's becoming larger, it's becoming sweeter in order to entice animals to come and eat it. And it's also becoming more attractive to animals, more brightly colored. So if we take a cross section through a stone fruit, we see that the ovary wall gets really thick as the fruit develops. So the ovary wall is called the pericarp. And in the mature fruit, we see that it's very thick, and it's also can usually be divided up into 3 layers. The exocarp, which would be the skin of the nectarine right along the outside. The mesocarp, which is the large fleshy part of the fruit. And then the innermost part of the fruit is called the endocarp. And in the case of the stone fruits, that endocarp is shown here in brown, and it's really, really hard. So that's probably what you call the pit. That is not the seed. If you break open that stony endocarp, you find the seed inside. So that's the basic structure of the fruit. So the ovary wall is called the pericarp, and generally we can recognize 3 layers within the pericarp: the exocarp, the mesocarp, and the endocarp. So now let's talk a little bit more about the function of fruits. They are one of the secrets to the success of the angiosperm group. So they are incredibly species rich, and their fruits have allowed them to survive and disperse to a wide variety of environments. One way the fruit helps many angiosperms survive is by protecting their seeds. In many cases, a fruit can be extremely hard, like think about an acorn. So that pericarp is hard, and it's protecting the seed inside from getting crushed and destroyed. The fruit that we were just looking at, the nectarine, not all of the pericarp is hard, but that endocarp is certainly aiding in protecting the seed. So the mesocarp is tasty, and that fruit may be eaten by animals, but that stony endocarp is going to protect the seed within it. Some fruits aid in seed dispersal. So for example, some fruits, like those pictured here of the American bladderwort, float. So these little fruits are filled with air, and they float on the water. So this is an example of a plant that lives in riparian areas, and it drops its fruits, these bladders, onto the water, and then the bladders float downstream and disperse the seeds far from the mother plant. You may have encountered seeds that stick to animals. So when you go on a walk and you come back and your socks are covered with tiny little seeds, if you look carefully at those seeds, you may find small barbs on them, little hooks that stick to the wool in your socks or the cotton in your socks. Those also stick to the fur of many mammals, and as those animals move around, they're dispersing those seeds. Some seeds catch the wind and they're dispersed by the wind. So the classic example of that is the dandelion fruits with these little appendages on them that catch the wind. They're extremely light fruits, and they're highly likely when the wind blows to be distributed far from the mother plant. Some fruits have evolved to be really tasty and nutritious. So the fruit is eaten by an animal. So think about, we've all seen bear poop just loaded with something like manzanita seeds. So those seeds should still be viable. In fact, some seeds require passing through the digestive tract of an animal in order to be stimulated to germinate. So that's a signal to them that they're ready to germinate. Sometimes the acid treatment or the mastication by animals triggers germination. So they get eaten, they're enticing to animals, they get eaten, the animal moves around, poops somewhere, and then the seed it finds itself in a new habitat. In some cases, animals like squirrels will actually plant seeds for the mother plant. So they'll pick up something like an acorn and with the intention of eating it, but they'll cache it in the ground somewhere and disperse that seed. Okay, so moving on to the types of fruits. So botanists recognize an array of fruits. You have examples of the different fruit types with diagrams in both your Trees and Shrubs of California book in the back, and also there's diagrams of the fruit types in your Pacific States wildflower books. So, as I mentioned previously, a fruit may be made entirely up of the ovary wall, or in some cases, it includes other floral parts. And when it includes other floral parts, it's called an accessory fruit. So, examples of accessory fruits include fruits like apples and pears. So in this illustration, we can see that the endocarp are those kind of papery things that are surrounding the seed in the apple. So those kind of hard, clear membranes, that's actually the endocarp. The mesocarp, if you move out from there until you get to this darker line that you can sometimes see when you cut an apple, that's mesocarp, and then that dark line is the exocarp. Everything from there to the skin of the apple is made up of parts of the flower that were not the ovary wall. So these fruits develop from an inferior or semi-inferior ovary, and these parts were actually other floral parts that were wrapped around that ovary. So that includes the sepals and the petals. A strawberry is also an example of an accessory fruit. So here we can see a strawberry flower. It has many stamens, and then inside you can see that it also has many carpels. And on this flower, we see that the fruit is starting to develop, and this cone-like structure is actually the receptacle. So a huge part of the strawberries that you eat is actually the receptacle of the flower rather than thickened ovary walls. So both apples and pears and also strawberries are examples of accessory fruits because they contain additional floral parts. They aren't just made from the ovary wall. Okay, so I want to start by talking about fruits that are classified as simple fruits. Simple fruits are those that develop from one carpel or from several fused carpels. So simple fruits can be fleshy and soft and moist, and that includes three different kinds of fruits. Fruits that botanists call berries, fruits that botanists call drupes, and fruits that botanists call pomes. So according to a botanist, a berry is a simple, fleshy fruit that has one to several carpels that have a completely fleshy pericarp. So that means they're soft all the way from the outside down to the seed. So I just want to point out that many of the things that we call berries in the grocery store aren't actually berries, and there are some things that might surprise you that are berries according to the botanical definition, and that includes fruits like tomatoes. So if we look at this cross section through a tomato, it's pretty clear that this tomato flower was made up of many fused carpels. That's what's forming all of these different chambers in the mature fruit. So the entire tomato, as you know from eating tomatoes, is fleshy, and it has many seeds. An avocado is another example of a berry. So you've got the leathery dark exocarp, and then you've got a completely soft mesocarp and endocarp. And then what you see inside is the seed. So it is completely soft until you get to that hard seed. Gooseberries are another example of a plant native to California that generates fruits that are berries. Okay, another kind of simple fleshy fruit is a drupe. And drupes are typically derived from a single carpel. They are typically one-seeded, and they have a stony endocarp. So the nectarines and peaches and plums would all be examples of drupes. So as we've said previously, that pit, what we see here, is actually the endocarp. If we were to break that open, we would see something, the seed inside, that looks kind of like an almond. And it's got a fleshy exocarp and a fleshy mesocarp. Other examples of drupes include elderberries. The last fleshy fruit that we're going to talk about is called a pome, and this is an accessory fruit. That's the botanical description for an apple and a pear, and it's generally generated from several fused carpels. And you can see that when you cut an apple this way. So when you cut it in half so that you can see the little endocarp and the seeds, and it looks like a little star. You can also see these little dots along the middle of the fruit. So those little dots sort of delineate the 5 carpels that made up this fruit. So there were 5 carpels that made up this fruit. Each of them had a row of seeds on the inner wall. And remember, the pomes are accessory fruits, so everything outside this pericarp wall to the skin of the apple is derived from other floral parts. not from the ovary wall. The other simple fruits are dry, and dry fruits can either be dehiscent, which means that the fruit opens up to release the seeds, or indehiscent. So we'll start by taking a look at the simple dry fruits that are dehiscent. So dry means that they're not fleshy, like nectarines and apples and tomatoes. And the first example of a dry dehiscent fruit that we'll take a look at is called a follicle. A follicle is derived from a single carpel, and it opens along one side. So this image is of a milkweed pod, and technically that pod or fruit is a follicle. So it opens up to release these seeds with these feathery, stringy-like appendages that allow them to catch the wind. Other examples of local plants that generate follicles include delphinium and also columbines. Legumes are the fruits in the Fabaceae family. So the plants in the Fabaceae family include beans and peas, and also plants like lupin, which there are many species of lupin native to California. So legumes are derived from a single carpel, and unlike follicles, like follicles, they are dehiscent, meaning they release the seeds, but unlike follicles, they open up on two sides. And you can see that here with these lupin fruits that have been torn apart. So as the lupin pods dry out, they start to build up pressure, some of them, and they snap when they open up. So they tear along both sides, and as they pop, they eject their seeds. So they're an example of a dry, dehiscent fruit. They open up to release those seeds. A silique is a kind of fruit that is seen in the mustard family or the Brassicaceae family. This is a fruit that's formed from two fused carpels rather than a single carpel, which was the case for the follicles and for the legumes. This is a picture of siliques in, I believe this is a cardamine species. And as you can see, the two outer walls kind of roll up and fall off. And then what's left is a papery partition that lies in between the two sections or the two carpels. That's unique to a silique and to the Brassicaceae family. So that's what makes it a silique, that papery partition in between the two carpels. Your Pacific States Wildflower book also talks about a silicle, which is similar to a silique, but it's a little bit shorter and a little bit wider generally. And then finally, the last group of dry dehiscent fruits that we'll look at are capsules. And capsules are derived from two or more fused carpels. So this is a capsule down here from a lily. So this would have been derived from a single ovary that was made up of 1, 2, 3 carpels. So capsules are found in lilies and also irises. They are another example of a dry, dehiscent fruit, but in this case, it's made up of 2 or more fused carpels. Now let's take a look at our last group of simple fruits. Remember, simple fruits develop from one carpel or from several fused carpels, and that is the dry, indehiscent fruits. So indehiscent means that they do not open up and release their seeds. One example of a dry indehiscent fruit is an achene. And an achene is a one-seeded fruit. And in the achenes, the seed coat does not adhere tightly to the pericarp. So one example of an achene is the fruits of the sunflower plant. So if you've cracked open a sunflower seed before, you know that the hull is kind of stony, and inside there's a seed, and when you open it up, it just kind of falls right out. That hull is the fruit, the pericarp, and the seed coat doesn't adhere tightly to it, so it can easily be removed from the fruit. That distinguishes achenes from grains, which are also one-seeded fruit, and those are what we call, grain is the term that we reserve for the fruits that are generated by grasses or members of the Poaceae family. In the case of the Poaceae family, the seed coat adheres really tightly to the pericarp, so you can't separate them. So think about a corn kernel. The stuff that you get stuck in between your teeth when you're eating popcorn is the pericarp. And in the unpopped seed, that is pressed really tightly to the seed coat. So you can't, it's really difficult to separate the two. A samara is another example of a dry indehiscent fruit. It can have one seed, like in ashes, or it can have two seeds, like we see here in the big leaf maple, Acer macrophyllum. Those wings are often involved in the dispersion of those seeds by wind. The last example of a simple fruit that we'll look at is a nut. So this is another dry and indehiscent fruit. It has an extremely hard pericarp that serves to protect the seed. It's often made up of one or maybe two fused carpels, and nuts include fruits like this hazelnut, which we see pictured down here. It also includes acorns and walnuts. It's a little tricky because there are a lot of things that we call nuts that are actually seeds, like, for example, almonds are not nuts. They're not a true nut, botanically speaking. They're just a seed that would be found inside a different kind of fruit, a drupe. Okay, so now let's take a look at aggregate fruits. Aggregate fruits come from gynecium, bearing more than one separate carpels. So I have a couple of examples of flowers here that have many carpels. So this is a magnolia flower. You can see all these carpels up here with these kind of curved styles. And then in this blackberry flower, the many carpels are these green structures towards the center of the flower. So these fruits are considered aggregates because each one of these carpels develops into a fruit known as a fruitlet, but collectively this flower forms just one fruit. So they all kind of merge together to create a single fruit. So a common example of an aggregate fruit that we all know really well is blackberries or raspberries. So here we can see, so we know what the blackberry flower looks like. Here we can see that some of the carpels have started to form fruit. So the ovary wall is thickening in some of these. And as we know, these structures are stuck together. These fruitlets are stuck together, forming one single aggregate fruit. For the magnolia, they produce a really impressive fruit that is an aggregate of follicles. So it's a dry aggregate fruit. Finally, the other option is that a fruit consists of the gynecia of more than one flower. So this is called a multiple fruit. So it's not just forming from separate carpels that are in the same flower, it's actually forming from different flowers. So this is a fruit that forms from an inflorescence. And a local example of a multiple fruit would be the fruit that forms from Cornus natalii, or mountain dogwood. So this is not a single flower that we're looking at here. These white things are not petals, they're actually showy bracts. What we have in the center is a cluster of tiny flowers. So this is an inflorescence, and therefore the fruit that forms from this inflorescence would be considered a multiple. Pineapple is another example of a multiple. It forms from a really kind of unique looking inflorescence. So a single fruit forms from many gynoecia that are involved in many flowers that are involved in this one inflorescence. So in conclusion, you should know how and when fruits develop. So they develop after fertilization occurs simultaneously with the development of the seed. And you should know that the fruit develops from the ovary wall, or in some cases from some other structures of the flower. You should be familiar with the basic structure and function of fruit, so you should know the difference between the exocarp and the mesocarp and the endocarp, and what fruits do for the angiosperm. So they aid in dispersal, and they often are protecting the seed. And finally, you should be able to identify the types of fruits, including simple fruits, which are generated from a single carpel or a single carpel that's, several fused carpels. Those simple fruits can be fleshy or they can be dry. The dry fruits, you should know the difference between the dehiscent and the indehiscent fruits. And you should also be familiar with aggregates and multiples and how they form. Thank you for listening.